This video discusses what standards-based grading is and justifies its use. In traditional grading, all assignments get a grade in points or a percentage. Here is shown a percentage, and then they get all put together into a final grade. A common example is when all the scores are averaged together. Averaging on a 100-point scale means zeros have a huge effect, which is demonstrated here. Student 1 has done pretty well on most of the assignments or exams or quizzes or whatever they are, getting an 85, which is usually a B, on almost all the assignments except for 2, which received zeros. Student 2 received a 68, which is usually a D plus, on all of the assignments, and you can see that they averaged to the same score, 68%. I would not say that student 1 and student 2 understand the material and have demonstrated their learning of the material to the same degree. So the zeros really do drag down student 1 quite a lot, even though they did well on most of the assignments, whereas student 2 is not doing very well on most of the assignments, and they end up with the same overall score. Because in traditional grading with a 100-point scale, the letter grades are mostly 10% each, so 90s in the 90s for an A, in the 80s for a B, 70s for C, 60s for D, and then everything else, which is 40% of the whole scale, is a failing grade, or an E here at Smith. So a failing grade has a huge effect. It really brings down in the grade. Another thing is that it's unclear why the student gets a 0. A 0 is often just because the assignment wasn't done, but we don't know if they didn't do the assignment because they forgot to, they were sick, or they couldn't do it. So you don't really know what the student knows or can do. You're not really getting a good sense of what they're capable of and what they've learned, unless the zeros are because they literally can't do it, but you don't know what the 0 indicates unless you talk to the student, of course. When all the other thing about traditional grading is when all the scores are used, it especially if they're all just averaged together without any specific weighting or anything, it doesn't really show growth over the course of a semester, and it doesn't really show progression in learning. And it's hard to know what the student really knows and doesn't know. You only know how they performed on overall assignments, but it doesn't necessarily tell you which of your learning goals they actually achieved and understood or got close to. Standards-based grading, on the other hand, focuses on the learning goals and specifically, and newer grades can replace older ones, and this can allow the student to demonstrate their growth and learning over the course of the semester. Early scores give feedback on where you are, but don't sync your final grade. Now, the way standards-based grading scores get put together into a final grade varies, but in this class, generally later grades replace earlier grades. And you're demonstrating kind of at least the highest level of mastery you've achieved on a particular standard. So in standards-based grading, we use standards. And the standards are linked to learning goals. So there are particular learning goals you might have for a class, then you grade specifically on those. So instead of getting like for assignment 1, if you got a 90%, it doesn't tell you which things, just from looking at that grade, you don't know whether what the 10% that missed, what that learning goal or how well they were doing on all the different, it tells you overall they're doing well, but it doesn't tell you which specific learning goals they're really achieving and demonstrating. Standards-based grading focuses on those particular learning goals and that you are interested in having the student demonstrate learning in, and grades on those. So each assignment may assess certain standards. Not usually a single assignment isn't going to assess all the standards, but you can see in this example here, assignment 1 assesses 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 standards out of 12. So not all the standards. Which assignments will be assessed on which standards and which specific standards we're using in a particular semester will be in your syllabus. So look to your syllabus or on Moodle for which standards you will be assessed in this particular course and which assignments will assess on those. Another thing to point out is that you can see that things like group work is only assessed with the group work assessment. I don't assess that separately on other assignments. We kind of do a separate assessment for that. So that has its kind of its own thing. And the lab notebook is, the documentation standard really is how you document everything you're doing in the lab notebook. So that's relatively unique to the lab notebook, but there may be other cases where I may ask you to demonstrate your ability to document your work in this course. But otherwise, most of the assessments, the standards are assessed in various assignments. Sometimes an assessment, a standard may only be assessed once in a semester, but if that is the case, you will always have a chance to revise and resubmit a particular assignment to be reassessed on that. So you always have the chance to show learning and growth on every standard if you choose to in the course. And because the later scores replace earlier scores, this helps you focus on the actual learning goals than on points and a growth mindset, so how you're actually growing and learning over the course of the semester. The way I assess the standards is on a 4-point scale. And the 4-point scale that I use is based modified off of a scale used published by Beatty in 2013. And while I record the numbers in my notebook, in my gradebook, I will generally focus you more on the words, so you're not thinking about it as points, because these are not points that you earn. It's more just a way to give a sense of what level of mastery or learning you've demonstrated so far. So if you get a 2 out of a 4 or an approaching score, it doesn't mean you've got a 50%. That's not exactly how it works. So don't focus on the numbers per se. I use numbers instead of words in my gradebook because I do need to put it all together in some way, and it is easier to put numbers together. But in general, you will be seeing more of the words. So the highest score you can receive on a standard is an excellent. And this is when something is truly excellent. There's really just about nothing incorrect or no flaws that I can find. You're really excellent. And I do not give out 4s easily. Proficient is when you're meeting the standard, you're generally showing an understanding, but there's some small mistakes or maybe one larger mistake. But you're generally showing good understanding, but there's some room for improvement. Approaching is when you're not fully meeting the standard. There's some bigger problems. You may show some understanding, but there's some really major things that really are showing that you have a lot of progress to make on that particular standard. And beginning is used when you're really not showing very much understanding at all. And so you're really not meeting the standard, and maybe you know a little bit, but it's not enough to really demonstrate understanding of whatever the standard is. So in general, I kind of see the proficient as like an A- B+ sort of range, whereas approaching is more kind of the C range, so to speak. And I also use an almost excellent, which in number terms is a 3.5, when something is not truly excellent, but it's super close. There's just some really minor things that need improvement. So I tend to actually use the almost excellent a lot more than the excellent. And at the beginning of the semester, I tend to give out a lot of approachings and proficients, and sometimes a few beginnings. If you are getting all excellents, all 4s, at the beginning of the semester, I would wonder why you're taking my course. What do I have to teach you? You are already demonstrating mastery of all the standards. So I do not expect you to be getting all excellence or even any excellence at the beginning of the semester. At the beginning of the semester, you're going to get more approaching, some proficients, maybe even some beginnings. By the end of the semester, I hope you will be able to demonstrate a lot of growth and learning, and you should be getting more proficiency and almost excellence and maybe some excellence by the end of the semester. And I also give a lot of feedback on every assignment and give you a chance. In most cases, you will have a chance to revise, especially when we're talking about the major paper for the semester. You will have a chance to revise and resubmit. And a lot of times, because I've given you a lot of feedback, you're able to to achieve a lot of excellent scores on your standards if you do choose to revise. Here's one example of how I figure out which score to give on a particular standard. So let's take the standard as an example of data analysis. So I want to know, are you demonstrating an understanding of how to do the data analysis? Are you picking the right analysis? Are you doing it correctly? Are you giving the correct values? Are you interpreting what those values mean, etc.? Are you rounding your numbers properly? That's actually kind of a pet peeve of mine, that people will just throw out what the calculator or the computer program or whatever gave you to like 20 decimal points, but clearly you don't have that level of accuracy. So you need to be able to demonstrate that you understand how to use numbers and how to calculate the numbers and things that are necessary in terms of the particular data analysis that you're doing in, say, a research project that you present in a paper. And so you can see here, this is a rubric for this particular standard of data analysis, and it shows you what would meet an excellent, proficient, approaching, and beginning level. But again, in general, and you will be given rubrics for all the assignments and things, so you can see how to meet the different standards. But in general, like I said, the excellent is like nothing wrong. And then almost excellent is very minor, and then proficient is pretty good, but like very good, but some like maybe a bunch of smaller mistakes or one big mistake kind of thing. And then an approaching is much larger problems. And then beginning is really not really understanding, in this case, how to do the data analysis, not picking the right one, not doing it correctly, not interpreting correctly, and not rounding the values properly. One thing that's really nice about using standards-based grading is that I can also see where problems are showing up for the class as a whole. So this graph here is demonstrating the results of the grading of a particular paper, so like a major paper for the course. And each group turns in a paper as a group. So each individual point that you see on here, the little blue points, represent the score on a particular group's paper. And there are multiple groups in several sections of the lab. And so each point represents the score on a particular paper by a group. And then the horizontal black bar represents the, I'm trying to remember if it's mean or median. I think it's the mean. Sometimes I use the mean, sometimes I use the median. I'm pretty sure this one is the average score on this particular one. So you can see that for almost all the standards, the class as a whole is proficient, and that's great. That's what I'm looking for. Excellents are fantastic, but proficient really means like you're getting it, well enough that you're showing that you mostly get it, right? There's some minor mistakes or maybe one bigger mistake, but generally you mostly are getting it. And so that's what I'm looking for. And however, you can see that under use of sources, the average for the class is approaching, which is below, it's not meeting the standard, right? It's not proficient. So that's a problem. What that means is that the class as a whole really needs to work on use of sources. So maybe that's something that I need to emphasize more and give a little extra help on to get the class up to proficient on all the standards. And you can see that some groups are getting excellent and almost excellent. And then there's a couple groups even getting in beginnings here and there. But most of the scores are at the proficient level, and that's great. With standards-based grading, you will see whether you're meeting the learning goals of the course because you'll be able to see if you reach a proficient or higher level on all the different standards. It'd be great if I could just leave it there, but Smith wants me to give a single letter grade to put together your performance in the entire course. Not ideal actually in the philosophy of standards-based grading, but that's what we have to do. So how do I do that? You should see your syllabus to see how your grade will be determined from the standard scores. You will also be given, at some point during the semester, you'll be given an Excel template where you can just kind of plug in your scores, remembering that you'll translate the words into numbers. So you will plug in those scores so you will be able to see what your grade is at a particular point in time, usually kind of later in the semester, because you won't have a lot of the scores until after you receive your feedback on your major paper, which is near the end of the semester. So try not to get too anxious about the fact that you don't know where you stand in the class, because it really is determined at the very, very end of the course, because with standards-based grading, you get to show progression. So what you're doing earlier in the semester does not necessarily say how you're going to end up at the end. Most people tend to do very well in the course if they keep up with the work, do the work, and revise the paper at the end. Most people do very well in the course. So because I focus on learning growth, you have a lot of opportunity to improve over the semester. And so again, don't freak out too much if you're not getting proficiency and above at the beginning of the semester, because usually by the end, most people are. Or know how to get there. So especially if you decide to revise and resubmit the last paper, the large paper assignment in the course, you will have a lot of feedback to help you figure out how to achieve excellence. If you are getting mostly proficiency in excellence, or 3s and 4s, you will probably get an A of some kind. Depends on if you have more excellence than proficiency or a lot of almost excellence. If you're getting more 3s than 4s, or more proficiency, like if you're getting proficient straight across the board, all of them, then you will get somewhere in the B range. If you have some, excellence to pull you up a little, you may be more like B+. If you're getting just a few approaching, you're probably also still in the B range. If you're getting a lot of approaching, that's the 2 in terms of the number that goes with it, then if you got straight 2s or straight approachings all the way across, then you would get a C. So a C is saying, like, again, you're showing some understanding, but you have some bigger problems. But I'd say in general in the course, if you are putting in a lot of effort and you take the feedback that I give you and revise and resubmit, that most people end up in the A or B range in the course.